I was 12 when I first saw the Harlow Orphanage. It stood at the far edge of our small English town, on a hill where the fog never seemed to lift, even in summer. The building was older than anyone could remember, and its brick walls were the color of dried blood. People in the village didn't talk about it much, except in whispers. They called it a house for the forgotten, though no one ever explained what that meant. I wasn't an orphan, not at first. My parents sent me there because they said they couldn't keep me anymore. My father had been injured at the docks, my mother too ill to work, and there was talk of debts. The day they left me, I stood in the yard as the carriage drove away, its wheels crunching over the gravel until the sound disappeared into the mist. The matron, Miss Claythorne, met me at the door. She was tall and thin, her face pale like paper, with eyes that never seemed to blink. She didn't say welcome. She only said, "You'll do your chores before you eat, and you'll do them without complaint." Then she handed me off to a boy named Peter, who was about my age but much thinner, as though the air in the orphanage had hollowed him out. Peter led me through dim corridors where the wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing darker, older wallpaper underneath. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. He showed me to the boys' dormitory, a long, cold room with iron beds and thin blankets. My bed was at the far end, near the window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The wind made the rafters creak, and somewhere deep in the building, I thought I heard a door slam. Then came the sound of something stranger, a faint scratching, like nails on paper. It was coming from beneath my bed. When I leaned down to look, I saw an envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed, and my name was written on it in shaky black ink. The handwriting was strange, not like anyone I knew, and the ink looked fresh, as if it had been written only hours ago. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. It read, "They are not sleeping. Do not trust the matron. You must find the others." There was no signature, no explanation, and the paper smelled faintly of smoke. I didn't know what it meant, but I hid the letter under my pillow. I thought about showing Peter, but something told me to keep it secret. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. The days at Harlow were filled with endless chores: scrubbing floors, polishing brass that never shone, and tending to the gardens that grew nothing but brittle weeds. The food was thin soup and hard bread, and the matron watched us eat in silence from the end of the table, her eyes never leaving our faces. But every night, more letters appeared. Sometimes they were tucked under my pillow, sometimes slipped into my coat pocket, and once I even found one inside my boot. Each letter was different, but all were written in the same uneven hand. They spoke of things I didn't understand: locked rooms in the East Wing, names of children I'd never met, and warnings about the watchers. One letter said, "Do not go into the chapel after dark. The walls remember." Another said, "Ask Peter about Thomas. He will lie. Watch his eyes." I began to notice things I hadn't before. Some children disappeared for days and returned pale and silent, their eyes vacant, as if they'd been dreaming with their eyes open. The matron would say they'd been ill and needed rest, but they never spoke of where they'd gone. One evening, while helping Peter carry laundry to the basement, I decided to ask him about Thomas. At first, he froze, his hands gripping the basket so tightly the wicker creaked. Then he said, "There is no Thomas," but his voice cracked, and his eyes darted toward the far wall of the basement. That wall was strange. Unlike the rest of the orphanage, it wasn't brick but old wooden boards, warped and stained. And there, just for a moment, I thought I heard a faint tapping from the other side. Peter noticed me listening and quickly dragged me away, muttering that the matron didn't like anyone lingering down there. That night, I received another letter. This one wasn't folded, it was crumpled, as though someone had tried to destroy it but changed their mind. The message was short: "Thomas is behind the wall. Don't let her find you." I couldn't sleep after reading it. My thoughts kept returning to the wall in the basement, to the hollow sound it made when I tapped it, and to the way Peter had refused to meet my eyes. Days passed, and the letters kept coming. Some were warnings, some instructions. One told me to count the steps from the dormitory to the chapel and remember the number. Another told me to watch the matron's office door, because it opens at night without a key. I began to feel like the orphanage itself was alive, watching, listening, waiting. The other children didn't talk about it, but I caught them glancing at the shadows in the hall, their faces tied with fear. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the dormitory. At first, I thought it was the matron making her rounds, but the footsteps were too light, too careful. I sat up and saw Peter standing at the foot of my bed, holding a candle. His face was pale, and he looked as though he'd been crying. Without saying a word, he handed me an envelope. It was different from the others, sealed with red wax stamped with the shape of a key. I broke the seal and unfolded the paper. It said, "Midnight. The basement wall. Bring no light." When I looked up to ask Peter what it meant, he was already gone. That was the moment I knew I couldn't ignore the letters any longer. Whatever was behind that wall, whatever had happened to Thomas, I was going to find out. But I didn't know then that the letters weren't just warnings, they were invitations. And once you accepted one, there was no going back. I couldn't stop thinking about that red waxed letter. All the other notes I'd found were hurried, almost desperate, as though they'd been written in secret and shoved into hiding places before anyone could catch the writer. But this one was different, neat, deliberate, sealed like something official. The key-shaped stamp made it feel final, as if accepting it meant I'd already agreed to something. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept glancing toward the window, watching the fog roll in from the moor, thicker than usual. It swirled against the glass in pale tendrils, and every time I blinked, I thought I saw shapes moving in it, tall, still figures watching from outside. My mind kept returning to the words, midnight. The basement wall. Bring no light. By the time the dormitory fell into silence, I'd decided I would go. But I also knew I couldn't let the matron, or anyone else, see me leave. She had a habit of appearing in the halls at strange hours, as though she never slept. I waited until I heard the old grandfather clock in the main hall chime 12. The sound echoed through the orphanage, deep and heavy. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The boards groaned under my weight, and I winced every time they did, certain it would wake the others. The corridor outside the dormitory was darker than I'd ever seen it. The single gas lamp at the far end had gone out, leaving only a dim glow from the moon filtering through the tall, narrow windows. The fog outside pressed against the glass so thickly that it blurred the world beyond into nothing but pale gray. I crept down the main staircase, keeping to the edges where the steps made less noise. The air grew colder as I descended, and by the time I reached the ground floor, I could see my breath in the faint light. The orphanage was utterly silent, no wind, no creaking rafters, not even the usual distant drip of water from the pipes. The door to the basement was at the end of a narrow corridor near the kitchens. I had to pass the matron's office to get there. Her door was closed, but as I passed, I noticed something strange. The light inside was on. A dim, flickering glow seeped through the crack at the bottom. I froze, my heart pounding. If she was awake, this was a terrible idea. I was about to turn back when I heard a sound from inside the office, a soft scraping, like chalk on a blackboard, followed by a low, rhythmic whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone made my stomach twist. I didn't stay to listen. The basement door was heavy, the wood swollen with age, but I managed to ease it open without a squeak. The stairs were steep and uneven, leading down into darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. I'd been told to bring no light, but the blackness was so complete it felt like a weight pressing against my eyes. I waited there, straining to hear anything in the dark. Then, from somewhere ahead, came the sound of shuffling footsteps. "Peter," I whispered. No answer, just the faint scrape of movement, then silence. I took a slow step forward, my hands outstretched, feeling for the wall. My fingertips brushed rough stone, and I followed it, inch by inch, until my palm met wood instead of rock. It was the wall. In the dark, it felt different than it had in the daylight, less solid, almost as if it was breathing. I placed my ear against it, and to my shock, I heard something on the other side, not tapping this time, but a slow, deliberate scratching, like a nail dragged across the wood. My throat went dry. "Thomas," I whispered. There was a pause. Then, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, a voice replied, "Not Thomas." I stumbled back, my heel catching on uneven stone. My instinct was to run, but before I could move, a hand gripped my arm in the dark. I nearly screamed, but then I heard Peter's voice, low and urgent. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "You're the one who gave me the letter," I hissed. "I had to. You don't understand, once they start writing to you, you can't stop. They'll find you no matter what you do." "What's behind the wall?" Peter's grip tightened. "Not what?" "Who?" Before I could ask more, the scratching behind the wall grew louder, faster, like whoever or whatever it was had grown agitated. And then came the whispering. Not one voice, but many, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I didn't know. Peter yanked me away from the wall. "Don't listen to them," he said sharply. "That's how they get in." "Get in?" I asked, but before he could answer, the basement door above us slammed shut. We froze. The sudden sound was deafening in the stillness. Footsteps began to descend the stairs, slow, deliberate, each one echoing off the stone. Peter's face, barely visible in the dim light from the cracks in the wall, went pale. "It's her," he whispered. I didn't need to ask who he meant. The matron's steps grew louder as she came closer. Peter pulled me into a narrow alcove between two shelves stacked with crates. We pressed ourselves into the shadows, barely breathing. The matron reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard her speak, not to us, but to the wall. "Not yet," she said softly. "You'll have him soon enough." The whispers from the other side of the wall grew excited, their strange language rising and falling like a chant. The matron stood there for what felt like forever, listening, nodding once, and then turning to climb back up the stairs. When the door closed again, I let out the breath I'd been holding. Peter didn't move until several minutes had passed. "We have to get back to the dormitory," he said, his voice shaking. If she knows we've been down here, what is going on? I interrupted. Who's behind that wall? What are those voices? Peter shook his head. You're not ready to know. But if you keep getting the letters, they'll tell you themselves. We slipped back upstairs without another word, the sound of our bare feet muffled against the worn steps. In the dormitory, I lay awake long after Peter had crawled into bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of the fog outside. Just before dawn, I felt something cold brush against my hand. I sat up, and there it was, another envelope, resting on my blanket. This one had no seal, no name. Just a single line inside, written in the same shaky black ink as the first letter I'd ever received: "You've heard us now. Next time, you will answer." I didn't know what they meant by answer. But I knew one thing: the wall was not going to leave me alone. The letter stayed under my pillow the whole next day. I didn't dare let it out of my sight, though I was terrified someone might notice the way I kept touching the corner of the paper through the fabric. The words "next time, you will answer" echoed in my head like a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. At breakfast, I kept stealing glances at Peter, wondering if he'd gotten another letter too. He ate in silence, staring into his bowl of porridge as if it might contain some hidden truth. I wanted to ask him, but Miss Claythorne sat at the end of the long dining table, watching us with her pale, unblinking eyes. Her fingers drummed slowly against the wood, her nails long and the color of old ivory. I noticed she wasn't eating. She never did. When the meal was over, we were sent to our chores. I was given the task of dusting the shelves in the east corridor, which no one ever seemed to use. The air there was colder, and the long rows of tall windows were covered in grime that turned the sunlight into a dim gray haze. The shelves were full of things I didn't recognize: bundles of dried herbs, jars of cloudy liquid, books whose titles had faded to nothing. I was halfway through the second shelf when I saw it, an envelope wedged between two books. My heart jumped. It was the same paper, the same shaky handwriting. This one hadn't been placed carefully; it looked as though it had been shoved there in haste. I slid it out and unfolded the paper inside. "You can hear us now. Tonight, when the clock strikes 12, go to the chapel door. Knock 3 times. Do not speak until we do." My hands trembled as I read it. I stuffed the note into my pocket and glanced around to see if anyone had been watching. The corridor was empty, but for the first time I noticed something: there were no sounds here. No creak of the old building, no voices of the other children, not even the faint rustle of my own clothes. It was as if this stretch of hallway had been cut out of the world entirely. That night, the thought of the chapel made my stomach twist. I'd only been there once before, on my second day, when Miss Claythorne had gathered us all for a morning service. The chapel was small, with cracked stone walls and a ceiling that seemed too low for the space. The windows were narrow and high, letting in only thin strips of light. The strange thing was the altar. It was made of black wood, polished so much it reflected your face like a mirror, but the reflection always looked wrong. I hadn't been back since. When midnight came, I crept from my bed and made my way through the orphanage. The floor was freezing under my bare feet, the fog outside curling against the windows like fingers. Every step toward the chapel felt heavier than the last. The door was at the far end of the west corridor, made of dark oak with iron hinges. I raised my hand and knocked 3 times, just as the letter instructed. The sound echoed in the silence like hammer blows. At first, nothing happened. I began to think I'd made a mistake, that maybe this was some cruel trick. Then, from behind the door, came a whisper, not loud, but clear: as if the speaker's mouth was pressed against the wood. "You hear us?" My voice caught in my throat. "Speak," the whisper urged. "Yes," I managed. The voice didn't sound like one person, it shifted in tone and pitch, as if several people were speaking through the same mouth. "You will answer when called. You will keep what we give you. You will not betray us to the Watcher." I knew who they meant by the Watcher. I promise," I said. There was a pause, then a faint scraping sound, as though something was being slid under the door. I looked down and saw another envelope, this one damp and stained. The paper felt wrong, too soft, as if it had been soaked in something and left to dry. I opened it and found a single word inside, written in the same jagged ink, "Thomas." Before I could ask what it meant, the whisper returned. "You will bring him to us. Behind the wall. Before the next turning of the moon." The voice faded, leaving only the silence. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might shake the door. I stepped back, clutching the letter, and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw Peter standing in the shadows of the corridor. "You went," he said flatly. "You knew about this." "I told you not to answer them," he whispered. "Now they won't let go. What do they want with Thomas?" Peter's jaw tightened. "Thomas isn't here anymore. Not in the way you think." I stared at him. "The letters say I have to bring him to the wall. What happens if I don't?" "You don't want to know." He looked over his shoulder, then back at me. "They'll tell you he's alive. They'll tell you he's waiting for you to save him. And maybe, in some way, that's true. But you have to understand, behind that wall, they're not people. Not anymore." Something in his voice told me he'd seen what was back there. The next few days were unbearable. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find another letter waiting for me. Sometimes I thought I heard faint whispers in the walls, calling my name. I didn't tell anyone, not even Peter, about the strange dreams I began to have. In the dreams, I stood in the basement, staring at the wooden wall. It would pulse gently, like the surface of water, and I could see faces beneath it, faces pressing outward, their mouths moving silently. Sometimes, one of them would look exactly like a child I'd seen in the orphanage that day. 3 nights after the chapel meeting, I woke to find a new letter lying on my chest. This one wasn't in an envelope. The ink was smudged, but I could still read it. "He is calling for you. You will find him in the place where the rain never dries." I didn't understand at first. Then I remembered the north courtyard. It was surrounded by high walls that trapped the damp, so the stones there were always slick and dark, even in summer. The next afternoon, I slipped away during chores and made my way there. The courtyard was empty, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone. I searched for any sign of Thomas, though I still didn't know what he looked like. Then I saw movement in the far corner, a figure crouched in the shadows. It was a boy, older than me, his clothes torn and his skin pale. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. "Thomas?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just raised one hand and pointed toward the basement door on the other side of the yard. I took a step toward him, but in that moment, I blinked and he was gone. I stood there in the damp silence, my heart racing, when I heard it again, the faintest whisper, curling through the air like smoke. Behind the wall. I didn't remember walking back inside. All I knew was that when I returned to the dormitory that evening, another envelope was waiting under my blanket. Inside was a single line: "You have seen him. Now you must bring him." I didn't know how. But I also knew if I didn't try, the voices wouldn't just haunt me. They'd come for me. I told myself I wouldn't go back to the north courtyard, but the promise didn't last long. The more I tried to focus on chores or meals, the more my mind replayed that single moment, Thomas, pale and still, pointing toward the basement door. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even moved apart from lifting his hand. But I could feel it. Whatever he was, wherever he'd been, he wanted me to follow. The next morning, I avoided Peter. He had a way of looking at me that made it impossible to keep secrets. I busied myself polishing the banisters on the main staircase, working until my hands were raw. Miss Claythorne passed by once, her shoes clicking on the wooden floor, and paused to watch me. "Thorough work," she said. Her voice was low, almost pleasant, but her eyes were cold. "You'll do well here if you remember your place." I nodded without looking up. When she was gone, I realized my knees were shaking. That afternoon, I slipped out again. The sky was gray and heavy, and the damp air clung to my skin. The north courtyard was as I'd left it, walls slick with moss, stones dark with permanent moisture. The smell was stronger now, a mix of mildew and something faintly sweet, almost rotten. I scanned the corners, half expecting Thomas to be there, but the courtyard was empty. A thin drizzle began to fall, though I couldn't see clouds moving above. "Thomas!" I called softly. The rain pattered on the stones, but there was no answer. I almost turned back when I heard it, a faint tapping, somewhere behind the wall on the far side of the yard. I moved closer, my shoe slipping on the wet stone, and pressed my ear against the wall. The tapping stopped. Then came a whisper, so soft it was almost part of the rain, underneath. I pulled back. "Underneath what?" I whispered. No answer, just the sound of water dripping somewhere unseen. I stepped back and looked at the base of the wall. A narrow gap ran along the bottom where the stones had shifted over time, and in that gap was something pale. I crouched down, reached in, and pulled it out. It was another envelope. The paper was soaked, the ink blurred but still legible. "When the rain falls inside, you will find the way." I didn't understand at first, but then I remembered something from my first week at Harlow. One of the older boys had told me never to go into the abandoned laundry room during a storm. He'd said the ceiling leaked in strange places, so the water fell in perfect lines, like strings. It wasn't raining hard enough now, but the letter was clear. I'd have to wait. That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind. The orphanage groaned and shifted like a living thing, and sometimes I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside the dormitory before moving on. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a new sound: rain, heavy and constant, lashing against the windows. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling like smoke. I got out of bed and crept through the sleeping dormitory. The floor was icy under my feet, and every step felt louder than it should have. I made my way down the narrow back stairs to the lower level, where the laundry room was. The door was stiff, the hinges complaining in a low groan as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first: damp cloth, rust, and something faintly sour. The room was long and low, with cracked stone walls and broken shelves leaning against them. And there it was, the rain. It fell from 3 points in the ceiling, each drop perfectly aligned so it landed in the same place every time, forming dark circles on the stone floor. The rest of the room was dry. I stepped closer, the sound of the water strangely loud. When I stood in the center of the room, between the 3 streams of rain, I saw something I hadn't from the doorway: scratches in the floor, forming a rough circle. The stone there was different, smoother, as if it had been worn down by years of touch. I knelt and pressed my hand against it. Cold. Then I heard a voice behind me. "You found it?" I spun around. Thomas was standing in the doorway. His clothes were dripping, his hair plastered to his head. His eyes were too wide, and in the dim light they seemed almost colorless. "You need to come with me," I said. He tilted his head, as if trying to understand the words. "It's not me you take," he whispered. "Then who?" "The one she hides." Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped back into the shadows, and I swear I saw his outline dissolve into the dark, like smoke dispersing in air. The whispers started then, not in the room but in my head, curling around my thoughts. "The way is below. The wall waits. The watcher sleeps." I looked back at the smooth circle of stone. Without thinking, I pushed against it. It didn't move at first, but then I felt it shift, turning slightly under my palms like the lid of a jar. A gap opened, and a rush of cold, damp air rose from below. A narrow staircase led down into blackness. I should have turned back. I should have run straight to Peter, or even Miss Claythorne, and told them everything. But the letters had hold of me now, the voices pressing at the edges of my mind. I stepped down into the dark. The air grew colder with each step. I could hear water dripping somewhere ahead, slow and steady. The walls were close, the stone slick under my hands. At the bottom, the passage widened into a small chamber. The ceiling was low, and the only light came from cracks in the stone where faint glimmers of the orphanage above filtered through. And there, in the center of the room, was another wall. Not stone this time, wood, dark and damp. I recognized it instantly. It was the same wall from the basement, the one Peter had warned me about. Only here, I was on the other side. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the surface. It was warm. The whispers grew louder. "Bring him. Bring him. Bring him." Something pressed against the wood from the other side, a hand, pale and thin, the nails blackened. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. And then I heard footsteps above, heavy, deliberate, moving across the floor of the orphanage. The whispers hissed, "The watcher." I ran back up the stairs, shoving the stone lid into place just as I heard the laundry room door creak open. Through the narrow gap, I saw the hem of Miss Claythorne's long skirt as she stepped inside. She stood there, perfectly still, her head turning slowly as if she could smell me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Finally, she left, her footsteps fading down the hall. I waited a long time before crawling out from behind the shelves. When I returned to my bed, another letter was waiting under my pillow. This one was written in darker ink, almost red. "The way is open. The wall is hungry." That was the moment I knew the voices weren't just asking for Thomas anymore. The letter burned in my hands. Not in the way fire burns, but in the way a bad dream lingers after you've woken, hot in the chest, impossible to shake off. "The wall is hungry." I'd read the words at least a dozen times before hiding the paper under my mattress. Sleep didn't come. Every creak of the dormitory, every shifting shadow from the moonlight through the fog, made me think of that pale hand pressing from the other side of the wood. And of Miss Claythorne. She hadn't said a word in the laundry room. She hadn't even called out. Just stood there, listening, breathing, like she already knew someone was in the dark with her. I couldn't decide if she'd been searching for me or waiting. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. My hands shook so badly at breakfast that I spilled my porridge. Miss Claythorne's eyes followed the spill as it spread across the table, then lifted to meet mine. "Careless," she said. I muttered an apology, and she didn't look away until I dropped my gaze. When the meal ended, Peter caught my sleeve as we were sent to chores. He pulled me into the shadow of the stairwell, his face pale. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't have," he said quietly. "I don't bother lying," he cut in. "They've been whispering louder. I can hear it, even when I'm awake." The fact that he could hear them too sent a jolt through me. "They said the way is open," I admitted. Peter's jaw tightened. "Then you've already done what they wanted. They won't stop now." "What do they want?" I asked. He looked toward the corridor, checking for any sign of the matron before answering. "To feed." My stomach twisted. "On what?" Peter's eyes flicked to the other children moving about the hall. He didn't need to say it. The rest of the day dragged, but my thoughts never left the staircase beneath the laundry room. I'd been on the other side of the wall almost close enough to touch what was in it. The voices had been excited then, pressing harder against the wood. I told myself I wouldn't go back. But by the time the grandfather clock struck midnight, I was already moving through the halls. The orphanage felt different at night now. The fog outside was so thick it turned the moonlight into a dull glow. The walls seemed to lean inward, and the air carried a faint hum, as though the building itself was listening. I reached the laundry room without seeing anyone. The stone circle in the floor opened easier this time, almost as if the mechanism remembered me. The descent felt shorter. At the bottom, I hesitated. The wall was there, damp and dark, but something was different. The wood pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat. "You brought the way," the whispers said in unison. "I don't know what you want from me," I whispered. "You will bring him. The one who lingers. The one she hides." "You mean Thomas?" The whispers shivered through the air. "He is not what he was. He waits to be remade." I didn't know what that meant, but before I could ask, I heard the soft creak of a door opening above. Someone was in the laundry room again. I froze. The footsteps this time were slow, deliberate, but heavier than Miss Claythorne's. The whispers hissed, "The Watcher's shadow." Then, from above, a voice I'd never heard before, "Come out of there, boy." It was deep, male, and calm, but there was something behind it, something like amusement. I backed away from the wall, my heart hammering, and started up the stairs. When I pushed at the stone circle, it didn't move. "Don't make me open it," the voice said. "You wouldn't like that." I pressed harder, but the stone stayed still, as if it had sealed itself. "Stay," the whispers urged. "Stay with us. He serves the Watcher." The footsteps above shifted. Something heavy scraped against the floor, and a faint beam of light pierced the darkness through the cracks. A shadow moved across it, broad-shouldered, still. And then the voice again, almost gentle, "She told me you'd find it." The stone began to turn, slowly, as if someone above was opening it. I ran. There was only one other way out of the chamber, a narrow archway opposite the wall. I hadn't noticed it before. The passage beyond was barely wide enough to squeeze through, the stone wet against my shoulders. The whispers followed me. "Run! Run! Run!" The passage sloped upward and ended in another wooden hatch. I pushed at it with all my strength until it finally gave way, and I stumbled out into darkness that smelled of dust and dry paper. I was in the orphanage library. I crouched behind a shelf, listening. The laundry room was far from here, too far for anyone to have followed me quickly. Still, I didn't dare move. The moonlight through the tall windows lit the rows of books in pale silver. Then I saw an envelope, lying on the floor between two shelves. I picked it up and unfolded the note inside. The Watcher's shadow serves her, but he fears the wall. Follow the fear. I didn't know who had written it, or how it had gotten here. But I knew this much: whoever the Watcher's shadow was, he wasn't working alone. When I finally returned to the dormitory, Peter was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed. "You heard him," he said. I nodded. "That wasn't her," Peter said. "That was the man who comes when she calls. He's not here all the time, but when he is, it means the wall is hungry." "Then we have to stop it," I said. Peter laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't stop the wall. You feed it, or it takes what it wants." I lay awake long after that, staring at the ceiling. The whispers didn't come this time, but that was worse. The silence felt heavy, expectant. When dawn came, another letter was waiting on my pillow. It wasn't written in the shaky black ink this time. The handwriting was neater, more deliberate. "She will call the shadow again soon. Bring Thomas before he does. Or you will take his place." I read it twice before hiding it in my pocket. I didn't know if the threat was real, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. If Thomas was out there, lingering in the damp corners of the orphanage, I had to find him before the shadow did. The letter's warning followed me all day. Every time a door creaked open or I caught sight of a tall figure at the far end of the corridor, I thought it might be him, the Watcher's shadow, come to find me. Peter noticed something was wrong. We were polishing the brass candlesticks in the dining hall when he leaned over and whispered, "You've got that look again. Like you're about to step into a pit." "They sent another letter," I murmured, keeping my eyes on the candlestick in front of me. "They said I have to bring Thomas before the shadow does. Or I'll take his place." Peter's hands stilled. "Then you're already in deeper than I thought." I set the candlestick down. "You've been avoiding telling me. Who is Thomas?" Peter didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the far end of the hall, where Miss Claythorne stood speaking quietly to one of the older girls. Her voice was low, but her posture was rigid, like she was giving instructions. Finally, Peter said, "Thomas came here 2 years ago. He wasn't like the others. He was stubborn. Asked questions. Wanted to know why parts of the building were locked, why kids disappeared and came back different. Or didn't come back at all." I swallowed. "So what happened to him?" "He found the wall," Peter said simply. "And the wall found him back." Before I could ask more, Miss Claythorne turned and began walking toward us. Peter immediately picked up his rag and bent over his work. I did the same. She passed without speaking, but her eyes lingered on me just long enough to make my chest tighten. By evening, I had decided I couldn't wait any longer. The fog outside was thicker than usual, curling against the windows like living smoke. That was when Thomas always seemed to appear, when the world outside the orphanage blurred away. After lights out, I slipped from bed and padded down the hall toward the north courtyard. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the smell of damp stone hit me before I even stepped outside. The courtyard was empty at first. The walls glistened with moisture, and the drizzle from earlier in the day still clung to the air. I stood in the center and whispered, "Thomas." Nothing. I waited longer, straining to hear anything beyond the faint drip of water. Then, from the far corner, A shape shifted in the mist. He was there leaning against the wall, head tilted, watching me. His clothes were the same as before, torn and damp, but his skin looked even paler, almost translucent. "I need to take you to the wall," I said quietly. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, "It's not me you need. It's the one she hides." "You said that before. Who is she hiding?" Thomas's gaze shifted toward the orphanage windows, where faint light glowed behind the fog. "She keeps them in the locked room. The one no one talks about. East Wing." "The East Wing's been shut for years," I said. "Not shut," he murmured. "Sealed. But there's still someone inside." Before I could ask more, he stepped backward into the fog, and I swear I saw him fade, not like walking away, but like smoke thinning into nothing. I went back inside, my mind racing. The East Wing was always cold when you walked past it, and the doors were nailed shut. But if Thomas was right, that's where the one she hides was, and maybe that was who the wall wanted. The next morning, I made an excuse to be sent on errands near the East Wing. The corridor there was different from the rest of the orphanage. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. The nailed door loomed at the end, the wood darkened with age. As I approached, I noticed something I'd never seen before: a thin slit in the wood, no wider than my finger. I leaned down and peered through. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then, slowly, a pale shape emerged from the shadows. A face. It was a child, younger than me, their hair tangled and eyes too large for their thin face. They didn't speak, but their lips moved silently, as if mouthing words I couldn't hear. My breath caught. A sudden hand clamped on my shoulder. I spun around to see Miss Claythorne standing there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut. I was just. "This wing is closed for repairs." "You know that," she said, though her eyes didn't match her tone. They were too still, too watchful. "Go back to your chores." I obeyed, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the image of that child in the dark. That night, there was another letter on my pillow. "The one she hides is the key. Find the way in. The shadow walks soon." I showed it to Peter the next day. His face went pale. "If the wall wants them, you can't let it get them. Whatever's behind there, it's worse than Thomas." "But if I don't," I hesitated. "They said I'll take his place." Peter looked at me for a long time, then shook his head. "Then maybe it's already too late for you." I didn't answer. I just went back to work, but my hands moved on their own, my thoughts fixed on the East Wing. That evening, the fog outside was so thick it felt like it was seeping into the halls. The older children whispered about hearing footsteps where no one was walking. After midnight, I took a small knife from the kitchen and crept back to the East Wing door. I pried at the nails holding the boards in place. The wood groaned, the sound far too loud in the silence. When I finally pulled the last board free, I slipped inside. The air was colder here, damp and heavy. My breath came out in white puffs. The corridor was lined with closed doors, their numbers faded. At the far end, I saw a faint light flickering like candlelight. I moved toward it, each step echoing on the warped floorboards. The light came from a room with a half-open door. Inside, the walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and in the center sat the child I'd seen through the slit. They looked up as I entered. Their voice was barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." "I need to get you out," I said. "They won't let me leave," the child replied. "Not until the wall is full." I took a step closer, but then I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and heavy. The shadow. The child's eyes widened. Too late. I turned toward the doorway, but all I saw was darkness creeping along the floor, swallowing the light.